This is Garis book readings of my 2 published paper books, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This is Chapter 6, Part 2 of my second book, entitled Multis and Monos, what the multicultured can teach the monocultured towards the creation of a global state. Part 6, Chapter 6 is entitled Institutions of Globa, Part 2. Continuing straight on. A similar logic will apply to Globa. Again, the EU has a lot of experience with creating laws that apply to all 27 countries of the EU and can help the global parliament. When a new country wishes to join the EU, a lengthy preparation phase of negotiation between the EU and the new candidate country is undertaken. The candidate country is usually required to modify many of its laws to bring them into line with those of the EU. One can readily imagine a similar process occurring in the future when a country wants to join Globa. If the EU keeps growing and changes its ideology into one of pioneering the formation of Globa, then at some stage the EU will need to change its name because it will no longer be European. The procedure of absorption of new candidate countries into the EU is already well established given its current 27 members, so adding more should not be too much of a problem, provided the political and ideological will exists. There will have been plenty of precedents for new candidate member states to follow. G. Global civil service. Any parliament needs a civil service to execute its laws. Global laws will need a global civil service. The members of this civil service will presumably be selected from around the world with an obvious prerequisite that they speak the world language fluently and have a good knowledge of world history and culture. Very probably, only the very brightest will pass the rigorous global civil service exams. The global civil service should foster an attitude that the very brightest people should devote themselves to public service, that is, the top jobs should go to the top people. The traditional American attitude that politicians are corrupt and public servants are mediocrities should be avoided and used as a countermodel. The United Nations has a lot of experience at a global level on how to organize a planet-wide civil service. Admittedly, the US became impatient with the UN's third world inefficiency and eventually stopped payments for a while, but such global civil service experience will not be wasted. The establishment of Globa can profit from this experience. Since Globa will require a civil service for the whole planet, it will be a lot bigger than national civil services. It's essential that it be organized to the standards of the best organized and richest countries so that it runs smoothly, without corruption, and is accountable. Since it will be the richest nations that will merge into mini-Globa the first, this is likely. The norms and customs of the global civil service will be well established by the time the poorer, politically less progressive nations decide to join. The civil service members of the countries that join Globa later will have to adapt to the pre-established norms of the global civil service, that is, to efficient, honest, accountable practices. H. Global police. Any sizable community requires a police force, except perhaps for a monastery. In any community there will be people who break the law and who need to be arrested. A global state will require a global police force. As nation-states merge into mini-Globa, the organizational hierarchy of a national police force will be given an extra layer, that is, the global layer. The hierarchy existing at national levels would very probably continue to exist, but what had been the top national level would then be subject to decisions coming from the global level. For example, in a multinational company that has branches in various nations, those branches have to accept decisions from the company's global headquarters. What types of crimes would a global police force be used to combat? Or rather, what types of global laws would a global police force be used to enforce? In the abstract sense, the answer to this question would be the global police force will enforce whatever laws are decided by the global parliament. But this answer is too facile and not very interesting. To give some concrete examples, we can imagine that a global police force may arrest people who kidnap children and take them from one former country to another, or launder drug money over different former countries. Laws concerning the global distribution of raw materials would obviously be at global level. I. Global court. Once criminals breaking global laws are arrested, they'll need to be tried and convicted. If the crime is major enough, this will be the job of the global court. Such a court already exists and is called simply Global Court. It's situated in The Hague in Holland, in Europe. One of its primary functions is to try and convict war criminals for crimes against humanity. Unfortunately, at the time of writing, the US has refused to allow itself to be subject to the jurisdiction of this global court, fearing that non-Americans may judge American military behavior as such crimes. Personally, I think the US will be one of the slower of the rich democratic nations to merge with Globa. It is too nationalistic and even chauvinistic to be willing to give up its sovereignty. America is still living in the 19th and 20th centuries in many respects. Using a similar reasoning to some of the above sections, there will be a hierarchy of courts, for example at the town level, city level, regional level, national level, union level, and at the global level. The global court will be used to try and to convict people who break the global laws, that is, large-scale important laws that have an impact on the global state, for example, major companies who pollute on a large scale, or companies who are considered to have broken global incomes policy laws, or global raw material distribution laws, etc. One obvious role of the global court will be to settle disputes between former nations that in the past may have led to war between those nations. For example, imagine two former countries get involved in a bitter trade war, then the World Court could be used to listen to both sides and then adjudicate. The decision of the court would then be binding on those former countries, since they are legal members of Globa and hence subject to Globa's laws. Actually, with regard to trade wars, that is, bitter trade disputes, there's already a form of global trade court called the WTO, World Trade Organization, which has the power to adjudicate between disputing nations. However, if the dispute were particularly bitter and substantial, then if push really came to shove, then at the time of writing, the nation-states could override the decisions of the WTO and appeal to national sovereignty or to national security. With members of Globa, however, such self-interested nationalism would not be allowed. It would not be possible. When member nations join Globa, they sign away their right to behave in such a way. J. Global military. One of the main reasons for creating Globa in the first place is to rid the world of wars. So if there are no more wars, why have a global military? The quick answer to this is to snuff out minor civil wars. With Globa, what were previously bitter disputes that led to war under the sovereign states system gets resolved in the global court. Most such disputes will be resolved this way. But there will always be small groups that break away and cause violence, even moderately large-scale violence that could not be contained by the global police. Under such circumstances, the global military would be called in by decision of the global parliament when no other alternative seems appropriate. An obvious example would be if a group of terrorists took a lot of hostages and started to kill them. A quick military intervention might then be considered by the global parliament to be warranted. The people who would execute such military action would be the global military. We could label such a military the GMF, Global Military Force. There are examples of such quick intervention forces that already exist. For example, NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a mixture of US and European military forces based in Brussels, Belgium, Europe, is becoming more and more such a force. The EU is also forming such a quick intervention force. Such forces differ from a national military for the simple reason they are not national, they are multinational. K. Globiversities and global education. One of the major goals of Globa would be to eradicate poverty around the world, and one of the most effective ways to do that is to educate the world's citizens. With BRAD, B-R-A-D, that's bit rate annual doubling, in other words, the speed of the internet doubles every year, and a much faster internet, it will become possible to create what I call Globiversities, that is, global universities, whose lectures are recorded and sent via the Globe media to the whole planet. Since there would be millions of students around the world listening to such lectures, the costs of producing the lectures and paying the professors would be amortized over those millions, and hence the per student cost of a lecture, and hence the course could be very cheap, and this is important. Hence even the citizens of very poor countries could afford to go to university. Perhaps some universities might offer their courses for free in the form of aid to poor countries, hoping to raise their living standards by educating their citizens. With a powerful internet, all education could be done online. Tutors and students could interact with each other in the global language and see each other face to face in vivid 3D images. For poor students, the prospect of getting such an internet-based education at a Globiversity would be a powerful motive to master the world language. Globiversities are just starting to get off the ground at the time of writing. That was 2007. Universities around the world are recording some of their lectures and putting them online in both audio and video. Placing video lectures online is still rather expensive, so usually these universities only upload a sample of their video lectures. But as the internet gets faster and recording such lectures gets a lot cheaper, then one can imagine universities putting all their lectures online in video format for the world to see. L. Global taxation. It's a stereotype to state that there are only two certainties in life, that is, death and taxes. No state, whether national or global, can survive without taxes. Someone has to pay the state employees who build the schools, the roads, the emergency wards at hospitals, etc. So a global state will need global taxation. In some countries that are federations, for example the US, there are two kinds of taxes, namely state and federal tax. When the US joins Globa, perhaps US citizens will then have to pay three taxes: state, federal, and global. In other countries that are federal, citizens only pay one tax, that is, federal tax, and then the federal governments give some of their tax monies to the states, so that there is federal control and policy over the states. One could imagine a similar policy applying to Globa, that is, that Globan citizens pay only one tax, and that is to Globa. The global politicians then decide how that tax money is to be spent on a global scale, so that, for example, some of the tax globos, that's the unit of currency for Globa, coming from the US could be spent in Upper Volta to pay for a Globan aid package to finance a better national irrigation scheme. The rate of tax would be decided by the global parliament and the global finance minister of the global political party in power. As the richest countries continue to get richer, it's likely that their traditional preoccupation with making more money will be diluted, so that resistance towards paying a disproportionately higher tax rate to the poorest countries will be lessened. One can imagine new attitudes growing in these countries, such as the rich countries should be generous to the poor countries, aiding one's fellow man, Globan solidarity, etc. M. Global wealth distribution. One of the major aims of Globa is to make the poorer nations richer. There are many ways to do this. One is a global taxation scheme. Another is a global education scheme. A third is to use progressive taxation, where the richer of the world's citizens pay a higher percentage of their income in tax to Globa, which is then funneled to the poorer countries to pay for investment projects, infrastructure to help the poorer countries create richer economies. Deciding what should be done in terms of global wealth distribution would be the task of the global parliament and the cabinet of the global president. In a global world, with a global language and global culture, the poorer of the world's citizens would be seen more as fellow Globans and hence worthy of our tax globos. N. Global resources. As mentioned in an earlier section, with Globa, the natural resources of the planet will belong to everyone. Just because there is oil under the ground in your region does not mean that it belongs to your region. It belongs to Globa, that is, to all the citizens of the Earth. This notion that the Earth's raw materials belong to everyone on the planet will probably prove to be one of the biggest obstacles to the creation of a global state. A prerequisite for creating an acceptance of such an attitude will, I believe, be the creation of a global culture with a global language and global values, and hence a strong sense of global belonging to the same global family. We are still a long way from this at the time of writing, because we do not yet really have a global language, nor a global culture. We do not yet have the technological tools to create such a culture, but they're coming, and coming fast. The Brad Law is a strong case in point. It's therefore likely that those countries not belonging to Globa, which have rich raw material wealth, such as the Arab countries and Norway with their oil, etc., will not choose readily to give up their traditional charity begins at home attitude and then share their wealth with poor third worlders? The creation of Globa necessitates a strong sense of living in a global community, which can only be built up incrementally. As described in various parts of this book, the various sovereign nations of the world are not going to pool their resources overnight. They'll do it gradually, step by step, and initially only with other nations similar to themselves with whom they can identify. For example, look at the gradual accretion of the European countries or the Mercosur countries in South America, etc. As people across the globe feel more at one with each other, they will become less reticent to share their nation's natural resources with the other countries in Globa or semi-Globa. O. Global unions. That's as in trade unions. One of the basic rights of people living under a democratic system is the right to form labour unions to combat the tendency of capitalist employers to exploit their employees. The Marxists of the 19th and 20th centuries had a point when they saw early capitalism as fundamentally exploitative. In an economic/political system that does not have labour unions or a workers' political party, it's possible for employers, that is, the owners of the machines of capital, to exploit the labour of its workers, its employees. Marx explained this exploitation using his idea of surplus value. Briefly, this concept can be described as follows. According to Marx, the factor that determines the value, that is the price, of a product is how much human labour time goes into its manufacture, that is a labour theory of value, an idea he got from the classical economist Ricardo. If the employee produces V units of value in the products he makes with 1 hour's work and works H hours a day, then that employee produces products with VH, that's V times H, units of value in a day. If the employer pays a wage of W units of value per day to the employee, then it may happen that VH does not equal to W. If in general W is more than VH for the employees of the employer, then the employer will make a loss and go out of business. So it is in the interest of the employer to pay the employees a wage W such that W is less than VH, so that the employer makes a profit. Actually, the employer has many other costs, for example, the price of buying the machines, paying for factory land, paying for ingredients, etc. Let these costs be C per day. So for the employer to make a profit with N employees, assuming they are paid the same wage, we need the condition that NVH is greater than C plus NW. It's in the interest of the employer to minimize W so as to maximize his personal profit. In the early days of capitalism, wage rates were barely enough to allow a worker and his family to survive. Early factory workers in the new industrial revolution lived in very poor conditions. Also, they had no choice because the traditional cottage industries were less productive and could not compete in commodity price with the much higher productivity levels of the machines in the factories. Thus they were forced to sell their labour to factory owners and hence became highly exploitable. There were no worker-based or labour-based political parties in those days, no progressive taxation, and definitely no labour unions to force employers to pay reasonable wages so as not to exploit their employees excessively. Workers soon learned to band together by forming labour unions. They went on strike and forced employers to pay better wages. They also pushed for universal suffrage, that is, so that they could vote. Once the labouring class had the vote, income policies were established by the parliaments, so that the excessive profits of the period of early capitalism became almost impossible. Workers' rights were much better respected. At one time in the 20th century, half the world's population lived under Marxist regimes, which were supposed to prevent the exploitation of workers. Ironically, at the time of writing, countries like China, Vietnam, North Korea, etc. are all supposedly Marxist in their basic philosophy, ban unions, keeping wages low, so as, particularly in the case of China, to attract foreign capitalist investment that takes advantage of low wage rates so that the employers, the capitalists, can make a greater profit. Thus countries like China and Vietnam, at the time of writing, are booming due to high foreign investment, but the average worker does not benefit very much from the boom, As a result, these modern-day capitalists are getting a lot richer than their workers. In China's case, the gap in incomes between the capitalist class and the working class is growing so large that public resentment is growing ever larger. Demonstrations and disputes grow by the month, so that the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, has an ever-growing headache. Ad-libbing, today's China, 2017. There are every year about 200,000 violent political demonstrations in China per year. 200,000. So the pressure cooker is heating up. It's only a question of time. This shithole regime cannot last much longer. Back to the book. Since most of the soldiers in the PLA, People's Liberation Army of China, come from the poor western region of the country, the CCP has a major problem on its hands. Once the PLA becomes disaffected with the CCP cannot use the army to stay in power, so it will probably fall or be forced to grant the right to form worker unions. So in light of the above, a basic right in any democratic regime is that workers can form labour unions. When a company introduces a new product or service that sells very well, then the workers of that company can push the employers to share the greater profit in the form of higher wages and profit sharing. That is, a percentage of the total profit goes to the employees. By this means, the material standard of living of the employees rises to their greater happiness. So, in a global context, in Globa, unions will be global. Their union leaders will be able to combat the tendency of global companies to exploit their workers by implementing global union policies that apply to the whole planet. Elected global union leaders will have great power because their policies will be global. Written into the global constitution would be a clause on the right to establish global unions. Such a right is basic for the establishment of economic, that is, material fairness, and to reduce the risk of material exploitation on the part of the employers, who always want to keep wages low to maximize their profits. P. Global Incomes Policy. As mentioned above, the global political parties will very probably include a global workers' political party. One of the main goals of such a party will be to represent the economic interest of the majority of people in the world's population who are employees in companies. In rich countries like the US or Japan, only about 10% of people are self-employed. The vast majority of people are employees, that is, are dependent upon employers, usually companies, and often big companies, for their livelihood. All these employees will have the vote, so very probably many of them will choose to vote for a party that does not permit excessive exploitation of the workers, the employees. In such worker-based parties will have an incomes policy, so that the differences in income levels do not become excessive. Since the majority of people are employees, all political parties will have to have an incomes policy in order to be politically competitive with worker-based parties. In Globa, policies will exist to foster the economic development of the poorer regions of the earth, particularly the Black African and Arab countries, which are the poorest at the time of writing. A global parliament with a global loyalty to all of Globa's citizens will establish a global incomes policy that encourages the poorer regions to adopt policies that will foster economic growth. This may not be easy in some cases. For example, there are many social critics of the Arab nations, including many Arab intellectuals themselves, who claim that Arab cultures devote too much time and energy on religious interests than on material, scientific interests, so that their populations remain poor due to ignorance of the methods needed to become richer. A global parliament with a global incomes policy will encourage the poorer regions of the earth to modernize their thinking and hence increase their material living standards. Of course, the more progressive, more modern regions of the earth will have to be careful not to push the poorer regions too hard or too fast. An optimal level of pressure will be needed. If the former push too fast, their efforts will actually be counterproductive due to a cultural backlash of the latter. Probably the wisest policy will be simply to supply all of the world's citizens with the means to tap into Glow media and then let people educate themselves. People may be ignorant, but they're not fools. Once they see with their own eyes, thanks to Glow media, how other people live and what other people believe, they will start asking questions and begin rejecting what they consider to be their own inferior lifestyles. Education is a powerful motivator, and ideas are the greatest educators. Q. Global Currency Unit. With a global parliament, global political parties, global incomes policies, etc., it makes sense that there ought to be a global currency unit, that is, a unit of monetary exchange that the whole world uses, so it would need a name. The Europeans created recently their euro as the monetary unit of the EU, European Union, or at least for those countries who decided to join the Eurozone. What might the name be of a global currency unit? I suggest the term globo, with the plural term being globos. Its symbol would be a capital G with 2 horizontal strokes instead of the single horizontal stroke of the normal capital G. These 2 strokes should be readily understood due to the analogy with the US dollar symbol being a capital S with 2 vertical strokes that cut the S, and with the EU euro symbol with 2 horizontal strokes that convert a capital C into the euro symbol, or with the 2 horizontal strokes that cut the capital letter Y of the Japanese yen. Having a global currency unit would be similar at the time of writing to having national currency units, e.g. the euro, the dollar, the yen, the RMB. That's the Chinese currency unit. RMB stands for renminbi, which is Chinese for people's money. It is normal for sovereign nations to have their own currency unit to simplify financial transactions between citizens of the state, and also a symbol of the sovereign nation. A global state would be no different. It would need its own currency unit and symbol. There would be no need for multiple currency units in a highly financially and culturally integrated world. A second currency unit would simply be redundant. The likelihood of the creation of the globo raises some interesting questions. What is the most probable route towards creating a global state is the European Union accretion model. As more and more non-European countries join the EU, the very title of the EU and the euro will need to change. It might seem rather arrogant of the new EU to call itself Globa and its currency unit Globo, when it is far from being a truly global state. So probably some other terms would be needed, that is, some form of transitional terms that later, once it becomes obvious to the whole world that a global state is truly in the making, a relabeling from the intermediate terms to the global terms could be reasonably made. Note, however, that a similar logic would not apply if the Update the United Nations route proves to be the successful path towards the creation of a global state. The term UN would be perfectly acceptable until there were no more nations, then the UN could change its name to Globa. What might these intermediate or interim terms be? I suggest for the name of the Post-National Political Unit, that's PNPU, the term Federa, and for its currency unit, the FEDER, F-E-D-E-R, with plural form Feders, and as the currency unit symbol, a small letter F with 2 horizontal strokes instead of the usual one. I suggest that the criterion to be used to decide when to switch these interim terms from Federa and Feder to Globa and Globo will be when 3/4 of the world's populations have joined Federa. This historic and symbolic name change could then put moral pressure on the straggling nations to join, because the very name change will signal the existence of a soon-to-be-born global state. However, what if there were more than one PNPU at a given time? This is quite possible. For example, the US and Canada might merge for a few years before merging with the EU. The African countries might convert their AU, African Union, into a political unit. Thus, it is quite probable that there will be several PNPUs. That's, what does PNPU stand for again? Can't find it quickly. I have to wait for the screen to come up because I have it highly magnified. It takes time. If the black African and Arab North African nations merge politically, perhaps they could call themselves Afriku, that is, the African Political Union. The currency unit could be called the Africa, with the symbol being the capital letter A, but with 2 horizontal strokes instead of the usual one. The above terms are only suggestions of mine. No doubt, when the time comes for creating them, the names chosen will be different, but what remains true will be the need for such new terms. What if several PNPUs are formed that are not particularly geographically based? For example, imagine North America and the EU merge, calling itself Federa, and another major bloc, e.g. the Asian nations and Russia merge. What could it call itself? Some term similar to Federa might be needed. For example, UNITA.